Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
Even today, they were watching excerpts of a speech which spelled out the commander-in-chief's gamble of a preemptive war.
Saddam Hussein and his terrorist allies could choose the moment of deadly conflict when they are strongest. We choose to meet that threat now, where it arises, before it can appear suddenly in our skies and cities.
Big issues, but on Capitol Hill the debating has stopped. We met a Democrat who today bites his tongue about the president's failed diplomacy.
And whether it's going to be a war or not was the debate. Now that the decision is made, Americans fall in line behind their president and particularly behind their troops.
In Parliament at home, they may be tearing themselves apart over the Iraq crisis, but here in America, they're already circling the wagons. Ever since 9/11, it has been considered unpatriotic to criticize the president's policy of preemptive war. Now that the troops are about to go into battle, the nation is wrapping itself in the flag.
Stopping that report, straight to the Commons and Mark Mardell.
217, that's the vote. That's the vote for the rebels. So that was a little bit up on last time. It was 199 last time, but not a vast increase. That doesn't suggest to me that there's that many more Labour rebels. Maybe 125, there were 121 last time. It is difficult to know exactly because we don't know the breakdown, we don't know how many Conservatives voted. But it looks to me like a slight increase in the rebellion, not huge. That's still, of course, not very good for Tony Blair. It's still not good. It is still a rebellion against the war, and that figure has gone up, but not by a huge amount.
Could you tell Mark what the response was on the government front bench from where you are there?
I saw Tony Blair and Jack Straw smiling. Now, I think a few years ago they wouldn't be smiling at a rebellion of this enormity, this number of people, including sort of the resignations. We've heard of another resignation in the last few minutes of a junior member of the government. But I think, yes, relief and pleasure that it isn't anything that people can really say that the rebellion is massing, is growing overwhelmingly. Nonetheless, the rebels will say, look, it's gone up again, the pressure is increasing, and some people were, of course, arguing that this vote was, with troops in action perhaps in a few hours, a few days, going to be taken much more seriously. So I don't think they'll be displeased, but they really haven't sort of embarrassed, humiliated the government to the extent that they perhaps hoped. But not a good vote for Tony Blair, not a good day for Tony Blair.
Mark, thank you for now. Let's recap, have a look at those figures then and see exactly what they were. For the amendment, that's to say these are the people against the war, 217. Against, the people on the government side, 396. I wonder what Andrew Marr, our political editor, makes of that. Andrew?
Well, luckily he agrees with Mark Mardell, Hugh. I think it's not a great day for the Prime Minister. This is, after all, another record rebellion. It's enormous. However, it's not enormous in terms of the extra number of Labour rebels. They'd be hoping for more people. A lot of people who promised their constituency associations last time round that they only supported the government because of the second resolution, this time have not gone into rebellion. There's been a lot of traffic both ways, but this is something that Tony Blair can easily live with for the time being.
So let's look ahead to the second vote, Andrew. Is the position likely to...
its own party?
It does look as if, from a glance, that 130 Labour MPs rebelled. Now, that's more than did a couple of weeks ago, but it is less than half the backbenchers. So, as Andrew was suggesting, Tony Blair will regard that as a victory for himself, perhaps worth all those private little meetings today. Maybe some of those meetings paid off, people being looked in the eye, finding it very hard when Tony Blair said to them directly, I expect you to vote with me tonight. Some of them clearly had a problem with defying him on that level. Earlier today, there were people talking about 150 Labour MPs rebelling, some even talking about figures higher than that. If it's 130, Tony Blair will be pleased. His whips, the people who organised the party, will get a big pat on the back, and he'll be able to claim, without dwelling on the figures, that actually a majority of his own MPs, his own backbenchers back him, as well as a majority, a comfortable majority, a big majority to be fair, in the House of Commons.
Just on that point of Mr Blair pressing the flesh in the tea room, I mean, he's obviously not known for nurturing the backbenchers. Do you think he's finally woken up to the fact that that actually is necessary, and that increasingly, if he's going to face an increasingly rebellious House, that he's going to have to do this more?
Well, one good thing that undoubtedly has come out of all of this is it's brought Parliament alive once again. It's made Labour MPs in particular, but all MPs across the board really, appreciate that they do have a role and a responsibility. It's made Tony Blair realise that he has to work on his backbenchers in a way that perhaps he had the luxury of not even bothering to do that for the first few years that he had as leader. He's recognised that he's had to go to the House of Commons, not just for his weekly question time where he has all kinds of things, but he's really had to make his case week in, week out. He's had different statements. His various ministers involved in different aspects of this have had to answer questions, not just on the floor of the House, but at select committees where there are real experts questioning them. It has brought Parliament alive. Parliament has had its say. Tony Blair now will be able to salvage something. Of course he's disappointed he hasn't got a second UN resolution. Of course he's anxious that some of his key European allies are against him. Of course he's worried that public opinion seems to be hostile to this war, but at least tonight he can say that the British Parliament has backed him in this venture.
Well, we see the House now filling up. Obviously, we're waiting for the results of that second vote, which is going to be on the government motion proposing that the House vote all necessary means to disarm Iraq. But just while we're waiting, Gitto, another question on Tony Blair's other tactic, which has obviously been to keep people like Claire Short on board by promising that humanitarian aid will be sorted out, that the rebuilding of Iraq will be taken seriously, that there will be that roadmap, that he's going to haul President Bush down that road to sorting out the Israel-Palestinian problem.
Yes, well, Claire Short is, as far as most friends of hers and enemies of her, politically at least, is concerned, is now a figure, if we're quite harsh about it, of ridicule. But she is symptomatic of what might have happened to a number of MPs, people who last Sunday faced with the very last minute decision and with Tony Blair breathing down their neck and the whips urging them to vote a certain way, actually decided they'd rather be on board than out there in the cold shouting from the sidelines. It's been a big, I think, humiliating episode for Claire Short, but an awful lot of Labour MPs seem to have gone through the same process.
Well, let's just, while we're waiting for this crucial vote, let's just recap where we've been today, which is for 10 hours in the House of Commons for this extraordinarily momentous vote. Here we have Speaker Michael Martin with this vote on the government motion.
The ayes to the right, 412. The noes to the left, 149.
So, Gitto, what do you make of that? 412 for the government, 149 against.
Well, the government will clearly be delighted with that. It's two-thirds of the House of Commons essentially behind the government's motion, and that motion taken quite sort of explicitly by Tony Blair as a motion that endorses war. With me, though, is a member of the government, one of the most senior cabinet figures, the Education Secretary, Charles Clarke, former Labour Party chairman. What do you make of that vote and the scale of the rebellion against you, first of all?
Well, I'm delighted we've got a majority of Parliament, a majority of the Labour Party in Parliament and a majority of Labour backbenchers endorsing the government's position. There's been a lot of tension about this, as you know and as you say. The Prime Minister is, I think rightly but nevertheless bravely, for the first time put a war issue to the vote of the Commons. That's never been the case. He's been very clear that Labour MPs have the right and duty to say what they think. He said at the Parliamentary Labour Party this morning that as far as he was concerned it wasn't a question of loyalty, it was a question of looking at the arguments, and he's gone out himself in the Parliamentary Labour Party this morning and in Parliament making the case very strongly.
It was pretty close in terms of the breakdown on the Parliamentary Party. We haven't got the exact list, but even if you had a majority there, it was
close because feelings, you're right, but it was close because feelings run very high on this, and the country is divided in many ways on this too. But it was important that Parliament gave a lead, and the Labour Party in Parliament did do just that. The arguments were, as I think you would agree, aired very, very fully in the debate today in a variety of different ways, but also not just today but previously, and people have made their position very clear.
How dangerous is it to go into a war with public opinion seemingly hostile, with key allies lined up against you like France and Germany, without a second UN resolution, and with almost half your own backbenchers voting against you?
I don't think France and Germany are against. They're not for. That may seem a point of a sophist, but I don't think that is the case. They're all clear. All members of the Security Council are clear that Saddam Hussein is not in compliance with UN resolutions which have been passed. There's been a dispute about the right way to proceed, but they acknowledge that Saddam Hussein is not in compliance and needs to go. As far as public opinion in this country is concerned, what I've detected throughout this, and I've spoken in meetings up and down the country and listened to people what people have to say, and I think what people are saying very, very clearly is they don't like the idea of war, they fear the idea of war, they want to go down the international route, they would have preferred a UN second resolution, which is why the Prime Minister sought to achieve it. Now they're saying they regret the French blocked it and their veto as the way they did. And what needs to happen is that the whole country needs to think about where we are now and support our troops as they try and make change in Iraq.
But how crucial is it now politically that the military campaign is short, swift, decisive, and not one that kills an awful lot of Iraqi civilians or even Iraqi soldiers?
That's very important indeed, but not for the political reasons you say. That is true politically, but it's important for the people of Iraq. And I heard what you said about Claire Short earlier, and I think the reason why Claire took the decision she did was that she was delighted that we had a UN Security Council resolution imminent on the question of how we reconstruct Iraq after war, which involves the whole United Nations, make sure the oil is for the benefit of the Iraqi people and not for the United States. And her own record in that area leads her to believe she can make a contribution. Now, people can be cynical about that, of course, and they will be. But I think that the whole question of how we conduct the war, exactly as you say, and then how we try and reconstruct the country is exceptionally important.
When should we expect war?
I can't tell you that. That's a matter for the military and for the top political leaders who deal with this situation. The fact is that the House of Commons has tonight given its authority to support the government in a very decisive way, not just Parliament as a whole, which was important, but also the Labour Party and the Parliamentary Labour Party backbenchers. All of those are very important constituencies.
On Monday, diplomacy was over. Is politics over now? Is it handover to the military?
I completely think that is not the case. Politics is very important in two big areas. Firstly, what kind of Iraq will be created in the future, and politics will be preeminent in that, making sure all countries are working to that end. And secondly, the point the Prime Minister emphasised today, the point about Middle East peace, which is core to this, and that is a highly political process. And one of the achievements of the Prime Minister has been to get President Bush and the United States to commit themselves to publishing the roadmap to peace in Palestine, to ensuring we have a Palestinian Prime Minister who has the ability to act, and politics is preeminent in those things. Obviously, the military will now look at how they conduct.
Good evening. Tonight will pass into history as one of the key political moments in the lifetime of most of us. Voting has been going on at Westminster with rebel Labour MPs flocking to vote against their leader and their government. 2 more ministers have resigned. Meanwhile, significant public opposition to war is being made clear by several hundred protesters outside Parliament who brought the streets of Westminster to a standstill. Earlier, the Prime Minister told the Commons that tonight's vote would determine the pattern of international politics for the next generation, as well as pointing towards war with Iraq and a profoundly changing relationship within Europe and between Europe and the United States. It was a day for democracy to demonstrate its power. It was also a time for Parliament to decide. Our political editor, Martha Carney, had a ringside seat. What an extraordinary day, Martha.
It certainly isn't. It's still going on, Gavin. Behind me you can see MPs coming out of the chamber after the second of their major votes today. And I suppose there's no more important question than deciding whether to make war or peace. And I think that was reflected in the intensity of the debate today. A number of MPs that I've talked to have been agonising about this decision for weeks and months, consulting their family, friends and constituency parties. As you said, it's caused 8 resignations from the government, including 3 ministers. And the first vote, which was on a rebel amendment, happened just a few moments ago, and I think you can see what happened in the vote.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 217. The noes to the left, 396.
Order. The ayes to the right, 217. The noes to the left, 396. The noes have it. unlocked.
Now, just to explain, the people supporting the amendment were the people opposing government policy. In other words, they're opposed to war. So just to put this into a little bit of context, in February, which was the last vote on the war, 392 MPs supported the government's position. 199 voted against Tony Blair, of which 122 were Labour rebels. This time, as you've been hearing, 396 voted with Tony Blair, 217 against. And as for the number of rebels, well, that's not quite clear yet. We don't know for certain until we've seen the voting list, which don't come out for a little while. But we have heard from a government source that the rebellion of Labour MPs is likely to be 139. Now, that is obviously, if that's the correct figure, is substantially up from the vote in February. Well, I'm joined now by Chris Smith, the former Cabinet Minister, who was one of the sponsors of the amendment. Now, Chris Smith, was this number higher than you'd been expecting?
It was higher than we'd been expecting. I thought we might get round about the same number as we had last time. There was intense pressure being exerted on backbenchers by the whips, by cabinet ministers, many people coming in to see Tony Blair in person and be persuaded. So in the face of all of that pressure, for a large number of Labour MPs to stand by their consciences and to vote to say now is not the time to go to war, I think is commendable.
On the other hand, at various points we've heard estimates of a possible rebellion of up to 200 MPs. In that respect, wasn't it a bit disappointing?
No, I've never thought that we would get that much more than we got last time. But to have an increased number both of Labour MPs voting for the amendment and overall 217 people going through the division lobby for an amendment that said now was not the right time to go to war, I think shows that there is real concern across all parts of the House of Commons about this rush to war.
But you have now lost the amendment. British troops are likely on the verge of war. Does that mean that your campaign is now at an end and that you will be giving unequivocal support to the Prime Minister?
In fact, our amendment gave unequivocal support to the troops in the event of hostilities starting, because, of course, when our troops are engaged in war, we need to make sure that they're properly supported, properly equipped,
but all this political dissent has been extremely disturbing for the troops. You hear them on the front line saying they're very worried about the political situation back home.
I think it is our democratic duty not to question the way in which troops are going to carry out their tasks with courage and with diligence. But I think it is our democratic duty to question at this stage whether those tasks should be imposed upon them. And that was the question that was at the heart of today's debate.
Chris Smith, thanks very much for joining me. And we've had just news that on the substantive